Hello, everybody. I've been getting a lot of questions about the audio, so I have turned my audio on now, and you should be able to hear me. I will respond to chats that are coming in to those of you in a second, but let us get started this morning. Welcome to the webinar. We appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us. My name is Tanya Shaw, and I'm the Operations and Technical Manager for the Center for Innovation and Resources. And before we get started, I just want to cover a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being presented by the Child Abuse Training and Technical Assistance Center, a project of the Center for Innovation and Resources. CATA receives funding by the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, also called Cal-OES, and that's in the Victim Services branch. We provide free training to California residents on issues regarding child abuse intervention, treatment, and response. And you can learn more about the CATA Center at www.cattacenter.org. Okay, so this might seem a little bit obvious, but for those of you who are not on the phone, the audio is set to come through your computer. So if you are on the computer, please make sure your speakers are plugged in and turned on. We will be using the chat panel to communicate today. So the chat panel is basically where you can ask questions. I'll try to answer all of the tech support questions immediately. And if you have questions for the presenter, we're going to save some time at the end for Q&A. If the presenter doesn't see the question come through chat because it can get kind of fast and she might miss it, we are keeping track, and we'll go back at the end and read her any questions that she might not have been able to get to during the presentation. You can also use the chat panel to provide feedback and network with your fellow participants. And I just want to point out that when you're sending a chat, please go make sure that you're sending to all participants. This is important because if you're sending it to the host, I'm the only person that can see it, and the presenter might not see your question. If you send it to the presenter and not to anyone else, she might miss it, and then I won't be able to read her the question at the end. So please make sure you choose all participants when sending your question. That way everybody can see it, and you have a better chance of having your chat not be missed. Okay, today I want to welcome Lisa Conradi. She's the Director of Clinical Operations at the Chadwick Center for Children and Families, Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego. And bear with me while I go ahead and set her audio and get her switched over to be the presenter. It'll take just a moment. Hi, Lisa, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Great.
Wonderful.
You should can you click over? Do you see where your slides are? I think I switched before I had a chance to switch over. It should say, if you just click right on the complex trauma, and it should switch over your slides.
There we go. Got it. Okay. I think we're ready.
Okay.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Tanya, and thank you to everybody for joining us on the webinar today. I'm delighted to spend the next hour with you talking about complex trauma and how it impacts the children and families that we serve every day. Just a little bit about myself. As Tanya said, I am the Director of Clinical Operations here at the Chadwick Center at Rady Children's Hospital. We are a large child advocacy center located in San Diego, California, and we serve approximately 1,000 kids each year for therapy services, and about another 1,000 receive medical and forensic interviewing services as part of the Child Advocacy Center. So I'm happy to talk a lot about the services that we do, but today we're really going to start with a focus on trauma and its impact on the children and families that we serve. So objectives for today is to really provide a framework for discussing complex trauma and its effects on children and where complex trauma really stands in the work that we do. I'm hoping at the end of today you'll be able to identify at least 3 ways complex trauma might be observed in a child's interaction with intervention and treatment professionals, as well as to be able to plan improvements for your agency to better serve children and families who have experienced trauma. So let's go ahead and just start with some real basic language that we've identified in terms of how we identify trauma and define it throughout our work. So acute trauma is the type of trauma that's essentially a single traumatic event that's limited in time. So this might include things like an incident of sexual abuse or exposure to a terrorist attack or a car accident. So these are one-time things that our families might experience. Many of you probably have the same experience that our folks at our center have, and that is that very few of our families come in with a single exposure to one traumatic event. Instead, many of our families have experienced something we call chronic trauma. So chronic trauma refers to the experience of multiple traumatic events. So that means multiple incidents of sexual abuse, exposure to multiple incidents of community violence, exposure to domestic violence on an ongoing basis, and in many cases, it might be multiple types of trauma over a multiple time frame. So the rest of our webinar today is going to be talking about something we call complex trauma. So complex trauma is not just the exposure to chronic trauma, although that's an important part of it, but it's the nature of that exposure. And what that means is that it is often the trauma that is experienced by the child or the adolescent when the trauma is caused by the person whose job it is to take care of them. So we'll just start to think a little bit about the frame that it can be terrifying to be in a car accident, but it can be even more terrifying when there's sexual abuse and the person whose job it is to take care of you is the one that hurt you. It can create certain effects, which we're going to go into a lot of detail about today. So that is our conversation. So when trauma is associated with the failure of those who should be protecting and nurturing the child, it has profound and far-reaching effects on nearly every aspect of the child's life. And that means that they might have many impairments in different areas of development and functioning. So that's what we're going to talk about now. So let's first begin by talking about attachment and relationships. So when relationships with primary caregivers are unstable or unpredictable, children learn that they cannot rely on others to help them. When caregivers exploit and abuse a child, the child learns that he or she is bad and the world is a terrible place. The majority of abused and neglected children have difficulty developing a strong, healthy attachment to a caregiver. If they don't have these healthy attachments, they can be more vulnerable to stress. This might lead to having some difficulty controlling and expressing their emotions, and they may react violently or inappropriately to situations. So I just want you to think about this for a minute related to the children and families that you serve. So what we're really talking about here is that how they form and maintain relationships can be severely impacted, and that can translate into how they form and maintain relationships with other folks in their lives, such as friends, other adults, supportive adults, as well as yourselves as professionals serving them. So what we might think is a bizarre reaction to us trying to help them is actually an effect of the attachment, and that for many of these kids who have a complex trauma history, they have learned that they can't trust the people whose job it is to take care of them. So one video that I often recommend that you watch, and there's a link to it up here. We're not going to watch it today, but I definitely recommend that you go watch it on your own. It's called the Still Face video. Some of you might have seen it in your graduate school education, but it's essentially a video about it's a study where there's a mom and a child, and the child is about a year old, and mom's playing with the child, and then the mom is directed to turn away for a moment and come back with what is called a still face, and hold that still face for about a minute. And what you see this is the longest minute of your life if you watch this video, because what you see happen is that initially the baby tries to engage the mom and laugh and giggle, and but over time starts to cry, starts to kind of scream, and then eventually shuts down, all in the course of about 60 seconds. I can't even imagine what this might have been like for this mother participating in this research study. But what it really shows us is that those interactions, those positive interactions, have amazing, they have far-reaching effects. So even this one moment in time in which the child didn't get that feedback, didn't have that supportive attachment, can really have consequences. So if you imagine that the child is in an environment where they consistently don't get that kind of feedback, how they would adapt to that. So I definitely recommend that you check out this video, as I do think it explains this point very well. So the next area that we're going to talk about today is the effects of trauma exposure on your physical health and the body and the brain. And this is an area that we are continuously learning much more about over time. So I want you to think about that every behavior that we see in a child with complex trauma can be mapped to how their brain has been impacted by that exposure. So this isn't just a difficult child who's trying to make our lives hard when we're trying to connect or we're trying to set boundaries or we're explaining an intervention or a process to that child and they don't recall it. A lot of this can be tracked back to how their brain has developed over time. So when a child grows up afraid or under constant or extreme stress, so in complex trauma, the immune system and the body's stress response systems may not develop normally. And again, we're learning more and more about this, and many of you have learned about the language of things like toxic stress. Later on, when that child or adult is exposed to even ordinary levels of stress, these systems may automatically respond as if the child is under extreme stress. So stress in an environment, and we're talking this extreme stress, not the kind of healthy doses of stress that we would expect, but this extreme stress can impair the development of the brain and nervous system. An absence of mental stimulation in some neglectful environments may limit the brain from developing to its full potential. Complexly traumatized youth frequently suffer with what we call body dysregulation issues. What this really means is that they might be hypersensitive to touch, or they're not impacted by touch at all. And I'm guessing that many of the folks on this call can think of a child that they have worked with where they go, oh, they really, they might have hit themselves up against the wall to get that feeling of touch. And for that reason, there's a whole literature on how do you tell if there are kind of body movement issues versus trauma. And I think that those are so intertwined that we have a lot to learn. But we will see a lot of those things happening with our kids. So as a result, we see some of our kids injure themselves without feeling pain, suffer from physical problems without being aware of them, or on the opposite side, they can complain of chronic pain in various body areas for which no physical abuses can be found. And I'm actually thinking of a child that is providing consultation and supervision on the case who has constant somatic complaints that has been to the doctor many, many times, and there's no identified medical cause for them, but that's their experience within their body. So the next area, effective trauma exposure, that we're going to talk about is that part of emotional responses. So looking at the emojis on this slide, many of you can probably identify, although I can't identify all the feelings that are up there, but you could probably get a sense of, the devil with the horns is being pretty darn pissed off, happiness, screaming, yelling. So there's a lot of different emotions represented on this slide that most of us can probably identify the majority of them. But our kids with complex trauma may have some real difficulty identifying, expressing, and managing these emotions and have limited language for expressing their feeling states. For a child with a complex trauma history, reminders of various traumatic events may be everywhere in the environment. So that child may react often, maybe powerfully, and have difficulty calming down when they are upset. So there's a lot of big feelings that'll go on. Having learned that the world is a dangerous place where even loved ones can't be trusted to protect you, children are often vigilant and guarded in their interactions with others and may be more likely to perceive a situation that you and I might find to be safe, normal, typical. In their minds, it might be perceived as stressful or dangerous. On the other hand, we see it the complete opposite as well. Many children learn to tune out, we call it emotional numbing, to these threats in their environment. And this, in my world, is actually a little more concerning in that it makes them vulnerable to this re-victimization. So they've never learned how to calm themselves down when they're upset, so they become overwhelmed very quickly, and as a result, become maybe overly fearful or retreat or just tune out. So we hear a lot about that process of dissociating to not really feel the feelings because they've never really learned how to manage those. And that's actually a great segue into our next effective trauma exposure, which is dissociation. Before I go into a lot of detail about this, I really want you guys to think that dissociation is along a continuum. There's healthy levels of dissociation. We dissociate quite a bit. You know, when I'm in person providing trainings like this, I think that some of you are probably dissociating right now. You just popped out for a second, and then you come back into the presentation. We can't pay attention for that long a period of time, and some would argue that the duration by which we can pay attention is actually decreasing. But there's a normal amount of dissociation in everyday life. I'm not talking about things that you might have heard of like dissociative identity disorder. But for some of our kids, when they encounter an overwhelming or terrifying experience, they may actually dissociate or separate themselves from the experience. So what that means is they feel they're in a dream, some altered state that is not quite real, or that the experience is happening to someone else. And I want you to think about why this actually might be helpful for a child with complex trauma history. So imagine, and this unfortunately is too often the cases that we see, is that children come in and they've been sexually abused for 5, 6, 7 years by a stepfather, by an uncle. And I want you to think for a minute about what that experience would be like if they were present for the full experience. So it's a pretty horrifying event. So it actually can be a helpful response in the moment to tolerating something that is terrifying, is to actually just remove yourself from your body and dissociate. The problem that comes in for us, though, and for our youth and families, is that these children and adolescents might then take that coping mechanism that was so helpful and important within a certain scary context, and then that is how they deal with the world every day. So these are the kids that are tuning out in class, that when you're trying to explain to them what's going to happen in therapy or what's going to happen with their case or whatever, that they've totally checked out. And we've had cases, many more than once, in which the child yes, the child in therapy, they tune out. You go, where did you go right there? And they have a moment where they just don't know. And that is pretty common. And I think to understand that it is part of a coping mechanism that is really effective for them, but it can actually then impede their ability to be fully present and take joy in daily activities. So as a result, we can see their learning can be impacted, classroom behavior, social interactions. And it's not always evident to others that a child is dissociating, and at times it might just seem like they're spacing out, daydreaming, or not paying attention. The next effective trauma exposure we're going to talk about is behavior. This is probably the one that, for me and for many of us, is what brings kids into our service and is the one that is the most obvious. So a child with complex trauma history might be easily triggered or set off and could react very intensely, much like the kiddos in the picture that you're seeing on your screen right now. As a result, complexly traumatized children may behave in ways that appear unpredictable, oppositional, volatile, and in some cases pretty extreme. And if a child dissociates often, kind of reflecting back on the previous slide, this will also affect their behavior. that child might seem spacey, detached, distant, or out of touch with reality. Complexly traumatized children are more likely to engage in high-risk behaviors. So these are the things that we get really concerned about, such as self-harm, unsafe sexual practices, and excessive risk-taking, such as operating a vehicle at high speed. So I want you to think, particularly if you're working with older youth and teenagers, that there's a normal amount of that risk-taking that happens as part of normal development. And just as a frame for everything that we're talking about, we understand what normal development is, and that all of these behaviors are really outside of that normal development. But when you think about behavior problems and engaging in high-risk behaviors, as I said, adolescents have it's normal part of their development, but in these kids it can be much more extreme, much more dangerous, and much more concerning to those around them. And as a result, they might be more likely to enter the juvenile justice system. So unfortunately, there is a pathway for some of our kids, and you can see it early on, unfortunately, and we do everything we can to alter the trajectory, but a pathway where these kids, if left untreated and we're not able to intervene in the ways that we need to, are in a pathway towards the juvenile justice system, which is something we don't want to happen. The next effect of trauma exposure is this idea of cognition. So cognition really is, how do you think, how do you learn? And when children grow up under conditions of constant threat, all their internal resources go towards survival. So I just want you to think about a situation in your life where, here's a not scary but kind of normal example. This morning I was checking in for a Southwest flight, and many of you know you have to enter you log into your phone and you enter your confirmation number. And I found my confirmation number and I was going to enter it into my phone, but I was going through it in my head. I was repeating it over and over again. And my husband starts talking to me about what we're going to do for dinner tonight, and I couldn't hold both of those things at the same time. Eventually I looked at him and said, I need just a second, and then I put my confirmation number into my phone. That's a pretty, nothing example, but to share the point that when you're focused so much on one piece of kind of survival, it's really hard to make the other, to learn and take in new information. So when these kids have learned to be in a chronic stress response mode, they may have trouble thinking a problem through calmly and considering multiple alternatives. They may find it hard to acquire new skills, to take in that new information, and may struggle with sustaining attention or curiosity. They can also be distracted by their trauma reactions and therefore show some deficits in their language development and what we call abstract reasoning. So really being able to make sense of the world and have some good judgment and decision. And these kids can have some learning difficulties that may require support in the academic environment. So one thing that you're probably picking up on in terms of themes of this presentation is that it takes a village really to support and help these kids. So we are talking about the learning environment. We're talking about their mental health. We're talking about speech and language. So for many of the kids that we serve, it's critical that there's multiple sources of support, because they don't just have area. For many of them, it's not just one area of difficulty. So the final effect that we're going to talk about today is what we call self-concept and future orientation. And I love the picture on the left-hand side, because I'm pretty sure my cat sees a panther when he looks in the mirror. He does not see a little 9-pound cat. And so for many of our kids, I'd love to have them really look at themselves and see the best of themselves and feel good about their future, and that there's hope and on the horizon for them. But unfortunately, one of the things that I'm sure you've noticed, that I've certainly noticed in the children and family that we've served, is that when you ask them about their future, they might not have a sense of it. So for example, I don't know what you guys were like when you were 16 or 17, but I was thinking about what college might look like, and I was planning and deciding what that was going to look like for me, and I was excited about it. For a lot of our kids, that may not be an option for them, and they really have no picture of what their future will look like. More than once I've heard when I ask them, a child, or an adolescent, what they see their life is going to be like in a year or two, I've actually heard that they're going to be dead, because and not that they have suicidal ideation at that point in time, but that they just can't fathom that world. They can't create that picture. And so, children learn their self-worth from the reactions of others, particularly those closest to them. Caregivers have the greatest influence on a child's sense of self-worth and value. Abuse and neglect make a child feel worthless and despondent, and a child who's abused may blame him or herself. And one of the things that I actually find most interesting about this idea of self-concept is that the earlier we can intervene, the better. So if a child is disclosed some sort of abuse or neglect, what happens in that family and what happens for that child over time, what we often see is that development of guilt and shame, that the event was their fault, that they shouldn't have worn this, they shouldn't have gotten their mom or dad mad, that they should have gotten better grades in school, and that everything would have been okay. So they take that on themselves. And if we don't intervene soon to essentially correct some of those, what we call maladaptive cognitions, but those things about their sense of self-concept, they actually will develop deeper sense of guilt and shame over time. And there was some great research that came out of Stanford, where they actually found that one of the #1 predictors of guilt and shame of PTSD was guilt and shame. And that was Victor Carrion's work, for those who are interested in it. And I just wanted to note that, because if we can get in there early and help have conversations about things like blame, psychoeducation about what it actually looks like in the process, and that the abuse didn't occur because they wore a certain outfit or dress or did anything, then we can actually help move them very quickly onto a more positive trajectory. So those are what we call the effects of complex trauma exposure, and that is really based on some of the work. There's a great paper that Cook and Spinazzola put out on complex trauma in children and adolescents that I would definitely recommend that you check out, that really highlights those impacts of complex trauma on our children and families. So the next thing that I really wanted to talk about, and we really see as an overlay and interaction with the trauma work that we do, and that's culture. So we've all spent some time trying to identify and figure out what culture is. But social and cultural realities both influence a children's risk for and experience of trauma. The data shows us that children from minority backgrounds are at increased risk for trauma exposure and subsequent development of PTSD. The reasons for that are probably a whole new webinar, but I just want you to think about that with the children and families that you serve. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or questioning youth contend with violence directed at them in response to suspicion about or declaration of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Immigrant and refugee families often face additional traumas and stressors, especially when they are undocumented. And I know in terms of the families that we're serving now, we've seen an increase in the reports of stress and fear in the past couple of months over that. And children's, families, and communities' responses to trauma vary by group. So while there's community responses, there's also that individual piece and how the family interacts with it. So when we think about the influence of culture on trauma, many children who have experienced complex trauma and come to the attention of the child welfare system, so the families that you're serving, are vulnerable to other kinds of life stressors. This includes discrimination in their community, negative stereotyping, poverty, and high rates of exposure to community violence. And I think it's important that we keep this lens on, that we understand that social and economic marginalization, deprivation, and powerlessness can create those barriers to services. And, you know, as we think about the work that we're doing every day, it can be incredibly we talk a lot about access, and I bet all of you talk a lot about access and think about the ways in which you can improve access to services for your children and families. And I think that's the important conversation to have, and to really look at what good access would look like and what improving it would look like. These kids that we see can have more severe symptomology for longer periods of time than their majority counterparts. Now, I will say that trauma responses, they do vary by culture. So one of the things to understand is that responding to trauma is universal in terms of physiological and social responses. So what that means is it kind of doesn't matter who you are, where you came from, what your background is, but when something terrifying happens to you, that's universal in terms of the physiology and the biology that you experience. But there are some protective factors and resilience that can be developed in terms of cultural identity and community and family connections. Cultural beliefs specifically can either help or hinder in regard to a child's reaction to trauma. One really good example for this is that the concept of shame is a culturally universal response to child sexual abuse. But the victim's experience of shame and the way it is handled by others, including family members, varies with culture. So I don't know how many of you have had this experience. I usually find it's fairly common that I might have two children, let's say 8-year-old girls, who come in with an experience of sexual abuse by an uncle or stepfather. Which unfortunately is the story I hear all the time, so that's the example I use when I give talks. And one family can come in and say, this is awful, we're cutting off contact to that person, we want to create a safe and protective environment. Another family can say, she's lying, she just wanted more attention, she made it happen. Those two different responses will speak volumes to how that child is going to recover over time. So the child that is supported has a lot more buffers and protective factors in place, and we could see that they could go through a pretty short amount of therapy and get right back on that trajectory and do just fine. Whereas the folks that have been shamed or guilt or have been blamed for the experience, we see a much different and more depressing picture with those families. So let's just talk for a moment about the long-term effects of trauma. So we've talked a lot about kind of the short-term impacts related to complex trauma, biology, cognitions, behavior, affect regulation. Those are kind of the immediate for these kids, but when it goes untreated over time, we see a whole host of longer-term effects. So these include things like their ability in general in life to trust others. So I want you to think not just about the kids that you're serving, but that the caregivers that you're serving as well. All too often, and this is our experience, and I would guess that some of you have had this experience as well, we will see a child come in, and then we will see them come in later as the caregiver for a child who had been abused. I was just talking to one of our forensic interviewers last week who's worked with us for over 20 years, and I asked her, how often do you see the children of kids that you interviewed? And she said, too often. And I think that what that means for us is of course, the importance of getting in there and intervening early, but also that we see these long-term effects. Things like trust, things like personal safety. So for some of these folks who are coming in as the caregiver when they'd come in earlier, they might have never learned what personal safety looks like, that they're more vulnerable to being victimized. And we had a story where the mom was saying, I didn't even know that I don't know what safe and healthy relationships look like. So when I married my husband I didn't know that he wasn't safe. And sometimes it's hard to know, but sometimes it's because they've just never learned what safety looks like. The other things we see are the difficulty in the ability to manage emotions throughout their lifespan. These are the parents that might be really mad at you and you're not fully understanding why, or very tearful, or they go up and down. Also their ability to navigate and adjust to life changes, as well as their physical and emotional responses to stress. So many of you have heard about the ACE study, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time there, except to say that if you're not aware of it, I definitely recommend that you check it out, and that this is a framework that we are really understanding not just about the psychological and mental health impacts of exposure to complex trauma, but that there's a true health issues related to the exposure of complex trauma. So things like disease, disability, lung cancer. So initially, as we thought about the ACE study, we really thought about how kids were exposed to these experiences, that they then took on some negative coping, took on some high-risk behaviors, which then led them to be more vulnerable to, cancer, heart disease, those sorts of things. What we're learning now is that piece about the brain development that I talked about earlier, and that the exposure to these experiences can actually disrupt the neurodevelopment. And so that also, even if they're not engaging in some of these high-risk behaviors, they still might be more vulnerable to disease and disability. So again, it really just highlights the importance of getting in there early with the work that we're doing and continuing throughout our lifespan. So there's a lot of conversations about how do you diagnose childhood trauma. So that, again, that's a whole other conversation. But one of the things I really want everybody on this call to take out, if you take one thing from this call, it's that not every child who is exposed to trauma meets the criteria of post-traumatic stress disorder, but at the same time, when trauma is in a child's history, we have to think about it within the context of the other diagnoses. So, for example, too often I hear a child has come in, they've been identified as having ADHD, and only later does the provider figure out that they've been exposed to chronic domestic violence for years, which does a really good job of training a child to be hyper-reactive, to check in all the time, and to therefore have a difficult time sitting still, paying attention. So there can be a lot of either co-occurring, because we hear, there's definitely cases where the child has both ADHD as well as trauma, but also just to really understanding the history and the diagnostic, and taking that into account when making the diagnosis is critical. So some of the diagnoses that I hear a lot about when we're talking about kids who've been exposed to trauma are, again, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, it's one of my favorites, conduct disorder, bipolar disorder, and reactive attachment. So that, including post-traumatic stress disorder, don't fully capture the extent of the developmental impact of trauma. And in fact, there is actually a movement to create something called the developmental trauma disorder. So the symptoms leading to these diagnoses may be a child's reaction to a trauma reminder, which can result in them being either aggressive, withdrawn, reckless, or engaging in self-injurious behaviors. Again, many of these children have a complex trauma history. So again, as you're coming into contact with these children and families, just to think about the bigger picture and their experience. And this is where things like assessment become particularly critical in the work that we do. So When we think about the assessment and treatment of complex trauma, the first thing I like to do is to clarify for folks what I mean by screening when I talk about that, and what I mean by assessment when I talk about that, as well as the concept of a psychological evaluation. So very quickly, the screening part is that kind of frontline worker, universally administered to determine a child or parent's trauma history and related symptoms. So that is the sort of thing that really is very quick, easy to administer, gives us a very quick snapshot essentially of which door do we go through. And that's understanding, is there a history, is there something we want to look at in a little bit more detail. A trauma assessment, this is the language that we use for more of a comprehensive assessment conducted by a mental health provider. And that'll include things, it's much more in-depth, it looks at much more symptoms, psychosocial functioning, developmental history, family history, so it's far more in-depth and complex. Whereas a psychological evaluation is really designed to answer a specific referral question and is usually conducted by a court-approved evaluator. So as long as we have the basic language, I think that that's important to think about in terms of where it falls. So many of the folks on this call, their role might be more thinking about the trauma screening and getting some of that basic information, and then ensuring that that child then gets referred to a trauma-informed mental health provider who can conduct more of an in-depth trauma assessment as well as trauma treatment. So the language of evidence-based practices with trauma treatment is a pretty common one that I'm guessing you guys have been hearing quite a bit about. What's evidence-based, what isn't? Some of you might be familiar that our particular center operates something called the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare, which really looks at the trauma treatment programs, looks at their research and provides a rating on how relevant the program is for child welfare, as well as how good is the research, how evidence-based is it. So that's a pretty robust conversation. What I think is important for this group to know is really, what does this kind of treatment look like? Whether you're talking about trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, child-parent psychotherapy, child and family traumatic stress intervention, which is a new one we've currently are implementing at our center. There are some things that we just feel are pretty core to that work, regardless of which evidence-based practice that you're focusing on. So the first core component is that building that strong therapeutic relationship. And I think in many ways it might go without saying, but I think that that is the glue that then provides the rest of the treatment. And I just saw something come into the chat about what is the name of the clearinghouse, and that's the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare. The website is www.cebc4cw.org, and I believe it's on my last slide, so if it's not, we'll make sure that you guys get that. But thinking about the core components of trauma-focused treatment, the next component is really that psychoeducation about normal responses to trauma. So it's very interesting because I've done a lot of reflection as I've done this work. I'm a psychologist. Going through my training early on, I worked with a lot of families where the children were exposed to domestic violence. And I remember going into a room before this language of evidence-based practice and trauma-focused was a part of the world that we're in, going into rooms with kids exposed to DV and not really knowing what to do, and really kind of thinking that they'll bring up when they're ready, right? And I cringe a little bit at thinking about that, knowing what I know now, but you know, that's where I was at the time. And what we've really learned is that trauma-focused treatment is something in which you really have to call out that this is what the treatment's about, and that you provide psychoeducation about normal responses to trauma. So saying the developer, one of the developers of TFCBT has a great story where a child had come to see her after being with another provider for a couple of years regarding sexual abuse, and this particular treatment provider, the new provider, had said to the child, what did you tell Dr. Smith about your sexual abuse or what your uncle did to you? And the child leaned forward to her and said, I didn't say anything because she wasn't ready for it. And I think that's such a great example that, this idea of waiting for the family to bring the issue up, as providers, it's our job to really bring that in the room. Now, how you do it in terms of development will vary, but I'm not going to go and have multiple sessions where the family doesn't know why they're here. Another core component is this idea of parent support, conjoint therapy, or parent training. I think we're a lot better about this than we used to be, but there was a time where even with very young children, there was a belief that therapy was private and that the parents didn't need to be a part of it. What we've really learned is that the parents, those caregivers, are the ones that are with the child most of the time, and that having them be involved, even if it can be a little challenging or difficult, will make a world of difference to that child. So we do whatever we can to get that parent engaged in treatment. If they're very young children, models like child-parent psychotherapy are really they're dyadic models. You don't have the child in there without the parent for most of it. As children get older, you might have more of this conjoint where some time is spent with the child on their own, some with the parent on their own, and some all together. And then as kids get older, adolescents, the therapy might be more primarily with the adolescent, but I want them to know that in the work that we do, their parent is a part of the team. And so it'll vary depending on the age of the child, but having that parent or caregiver involvement is critical. The next core component is this idea of emotional expression and regulation skills. So if you guys recall, we talked earlier about that many of our kids may not know what all those emojis reflected. And so it's really sitting down and working with them to help identify and connect with their own emotions and regulation, and that's work that can happen. The next one is anxiety management and relaxation skills. So again, I think maybe the best way to think about this is if you think about things like systematic desensitization, so what that essentially is that you go to a therapist because you're afraid of snakes and you want to get over your fear of snakes. What the therapist would likely do is work with you to identify on a scale from 1 to 10, what is the most tolerable thing that you could do with a snake, that might be looking at a picture, to the most scary or frightening, and that would be maybe holding a snake, right? And so you put a series of exposures on this list from 1 to 10, and then you gradually work through each of those exposures. And along the way, you practice emotion regulation, you practice, you do some deep breathing, anxiety management, and so as you get through the process, you can tolerate that really scary thing more and more and more. Now, when we do trauma treatment, part of it has this kind of systematic desensitization component, and what that means is we're not going to expose the person to the trauma again, but talking about it is scary and is that exposure to them, because as we've talked about, there might be avoiding of certain situations and triggers. So talking through it slowly, moving through those different types of exposure will really be helpful. So you really got to equip the child or the youth with skills on how to manage that anxiety, deep breathing exercises, those sorts of things. The next component is that trauma processing and integration. So again, telling that story, and you might tell the story kind of quickly with the basics the first time and then go into more detail the second time. We'll often have the child or youth, once they're ready for this piece of it, tell the story multiple times until they're desensitized to it, because that process of continuing to avoid is what will lead to that triggers. But the more they tell the story, the more they face it, the less activated that they'll get by it. The next component is this kind of personal safety training and other important empowerment activities. Really think about things like boundaries, self-protection, those types of things, so that they can feel that they have some power and control over their world and that they're not just victims to what happens to them. And then finally, resilience and closure. Sometimes it can be hard to get a good termination. It can be a hard thing to do, but it's really important that we do it. So the next slide talks about some of the most common models of treatment for complex trauma. So for children and adolescents and young adults, something called ARC, which is out of, I believe, Boston, trauma systems therapy. So I won't go into a lot of detail about this, but other things, I will note that many of you are familiar with trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy or child-parent psychotherapy. Those models may not have been designed specifically for complex trauma. Many have more of that single-incident trauma, but they've been adapted over time to really address complex trauma, so they would be definitely helpful models as well. And the last thing I wanted to talk about today is the importance of cultivating resilience. We really want to end any conversation we talk about related to complex trauma on a positive note. So resilience is that ability to overcome adversity and thrive in the face of risk. And I have met many, many youth who have really horrific trauma histories who are able to overcome that adversity. So the brain, for a long time, we thought that after the age of 5, you couldn't rewire. That was done. Now, we know that that's not true anymore, and that the brain, we have so much more to learn about it. But this, what they call neuroplasticity, allows for the rewiring of these neural connections, and this happens primarily through corrective relationships and experiences. And I really want to highlight that everybody on this call in the work that you do have the opportunity to really support those corrective relationships and experiences, and that the more people that a child or youth has in their life who model these positive and corrective relationships, the better the chance the child has to get right back onto their developmental trajectory. And in fact, if you ask a youth alumni, you know, we've had the experience of working with some great youth alumni of CARE with really bad histories, been through quite a bit, and you ask them but they're very resilient. You ask them, what did it for you? What made the difference for you? Every single one of them will say, somebody believed in me. And I think that for all the scary things that complex trauma, you know, it sounds like that, you know, it can be kind of negative and feel like this is so much out of our control. The reality is that everything there are opportunities for those corrective relationships and experiences. I do see there's a question that came on the use of the emotional freedom technique on working with youth who've been traumatized. You know, I'm not very familiar with it. I do know that it was reviewed by the Clearinghouse. They have pretty high expectations for the kinds of research in terms of randomized control trials and those sorts of things. So I think I haven't seen that with a rating on the Clearinghouse, but I do think it'd probably be worth looking into it a little bit more. I'm just not that familiar with that particular model. So in terms of, you know, thinking about the factors that really enhance resilience, things like family support, peer support, competence. I just met a youth who just really happened to be good at school, and that was her main source of resilience. And she'd grown up and aged out of foster care and is doing amazingly well, and a lot of that's because she feels really competent in school, and so she pursued that. Things like self-efficacy, self-esteem, school connectedness, as well as spiritual beliefs. These are all things that can really help support and enhance resilience. There's a number of other kinds of protective factors. There's individual characteristics such as cognitive ability, internal locus of control, I have control over my life, temperament, family characteristics such as family cohesion, social support, community characteristics such as positive school experiences, peers and mentors, and then as well as cultural protective factors. So a strong sense of cultural identity, spirituality, connection to a community. So what can you all do as professionals in this work? So one of the things we really like to do is talk about safety and what does safety look like, help create safety plans with families. Also helping the child and caregivers identify existing or potential trauma triggers for the child, coping skills to manage the child's reaction, really having the conversation, saying what are you scared of, what can we do, being willing to talk about it. Help caregivers with their own history of trauma to identify and manage their own triggers, because children heal in the context of their caregivers. The other thing we talk a lot about is helping the child feel safe during key transition points. So that's things like, what can we do at the point of removal? What can we do during the investigation phase? What can we do to help the child feel more safe when there is a change of placement? And some of those aren't rocket science. There are things like, what would make you feel safe right now? Do you need to take something with you? Preparing them for what the next placement might look like to really help decrease some of those sense of anxiety that can come up, I think, for any of us if we were in that same situation. Other things that we can do is using screening tools with children and families to get that quick snapshot, gather a history of that full picture, trauma exposure and impact, immediate needs and concerns, ensure that families are referred for culturally appropriate trauma assessment and treatment, and gain a better understanding of the range of available programs and treatment approaches. So at this point, I think we're opening it up for questions, but I wanted to highlight the resources. A lot of what I talked about today is built on the great work of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. They have a whole complex trauma area of their website, but also in general, the website's a great resource. That California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare that I mentioned earlier, the link to that is here, as well as to our center. So with that, I think I'll open it up and see if there's any additional questions that the group has.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I think you covered all the questions that have come in to me. If there were any questions that maybe were sent directly to, if it didn't go to all participants, we might have missed those. So if you think you asked a question and it didn't get answered, please go ahead and re-type that in right now. And people have been asking about the slides, and if it's okay with Lisa, we'll go ahead and send those out in a follow-up email. Probably as soon as the recording's ready, I'll send the email out to everybody as well. So that would be probably tomorrow. And we'll just send the attached slides as a kind of like you would get as a handout if it was an in-person training. And also, if you're on the phone right now, I would really appreciate an email from you. I know there were a lot of people that weren't able to log in because we had so many people come today, which is really exciting for us and really exciting for Lisa. So if you're on the phone, can you please send me an email? You can send that email to catta@cirinc.org. Let me know how many people are listening and your names if you're on the phone and you weren't able to log in on the computer. Also, if you do have some people that are watching as a group, I know some people had to double up in offices and things like that as we got super full. So if you could just shoot me an email if you're watching with a group of people, how many people might be watching with you. That way we can please get a good count of how many people came today. That would be great. I'm typing that address in. It's also for those listening, catta@cirinc.org. Thanks again, everybody, for coming. If you do end up with any questions for our presenter today or any questions for us, please go ahead and email those on to us too. We'd be happy to forward those on to her as well. And I think we're probably going to wrap it up right on time. Thanks again, Lisa, for coming and sharing all of that information with us. It was great.
Thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure to be on the call with all of you.
We will be sending out a certificate in that follow-up email, a certificate of participation in that follow-up email as well. Thanks for the question.